Imagine opening your medicine cabinet one morning in 1942 and finding a rule printed in fine letters at the bottom of a small metal tin. A rule that said you couldn't buy another one until this one was empty. A rule that meant your family's cleanliness, your dignity, your health, even your smile, now depended on a container no bigger than your palm. This wasn't sugar, it wasn't meat, it wasn't gasoline, it was tooth powder. And for 4 long years, that little tin quietly decided who stayed clean and who went without. There's a sound some of you might remember, the soft scrape of metal on metal, the twist of a lid, the faint puff of chalk-white powder rising in the bathroom light. Inside that tin, round, simple, painted with bright letters, was something that felt almost too ordinary to matter. Colgate, Squibb, Dr. Lyons, Kellogg's, Pepsodent, Sozodont, names your mother knew, names your grandmother trusted, names whispered in drugstore aisles and printed in magazine advertisements that promised sparkling teeth and confident smiles. But during World War II, that tin became something else entirely. It became a ration, a responsibility, a test. Your grandparents might have told you about ration books for meat and sugar, about standing in line for gasoline, about the endless conservation of rubber and tin and steel. But they might not have mentioned this, the small humiliation of running out of tooth powder, the quiet fear of not being able to keep their teeth clean, the strange weight of a rule so simple it sounded almost ridiculous, until it wasn't. By April 1942, the War Production Board ordered that metal, tin, lead, aluminum be redirected to the war effort. Tanks needed it, ammunition needed it, ships needed it. And so, if you wanted to buy a new tube of toothpaste or a new tin of tooth powder, you had to bring the old one back to the store first. Empty. Flattened. Proof that you weren't hoarding. Proof that you were doing your part. Most families nodded when they heard the news. It made sense. The boys overseas needed that metal more than civilians needed convenience. But most families didn't realize what that rule really meant. Not yet. Because hidden inside that simple exchange, a tin for a tin, was something most families never noticed. A lesson about control, about dignity, about how the smallest things can govern survival. Before the war, tooth powder was everywhere. It sat in medicine cabinets across America, next to combs and razors and bottles of tonic. It came in small metal tins with screw-top lids, sometimes painted red or blue, sometimes plain silver. Common ingredients included orris root, powdered cuttlebone, sodium bicarbonate, baking soda, calcium carbonate, chalk, and charcoal. Some tins contained camphor or phenol for antiseptic properties. Others added peppermint oil or cinnamon for flavor. You'd twist the lid off, dip your damp toothbrush into the fine, chalky powder, and brush. It was simpler then. Toothpaste, cheaper too. And for millions of Americans still recovering from the Depression, cheap mattered. Dr. Lyon's tooth powder was established in 1866 by Dr. J.W. Lyon, manufactured by the R.L. Watkins Company in Cleveland, Ohio. The label promised it contained no drugs, grit, pumice, acid, or other harmful ingredients. Colgate, already a household name, sold their tooth powder in distinctive tins painted with cheerful red lettering. Sozodont, one of the most popular brands of the late 1800s, had shifted from liquid to powder by the 1940s, though it still carried a reputation for quality. In rural homes especially, tooth powder was the standard. Your grandmother might remember her mother keeping the tin on the second shelf of the cabinet, right next to the iodine and aspirin. She might remember the dry rasp of the lid being unscrewed every morning and evening, the faint smell of mint mixed with chalk, the way the powder sometimes clumped if moisture got inside. Toothpaste had overtaken tooth powder as the more popular form of dentifrice by the mid-1940s, claiming around 75% of the American market in 1949. But during the war years, tooth powder was still everywhere. especially for older folks, especially for families who'd grown up believing that a little powder on a brush was all you needed to keep your teeth strong. And then, in the spring of 1942, the rules changed. On April 2nd, the War Production Board announced that tin, the metal used in those little tins, in toothpaste tubes, in shaving cream containers, would now be reserved for military use. If you wanted a new tin of tooth powder, you had to turn in your old one first. The newspapers explained it plainly. The radio announcers read it aloud during the evening broadcasts, their voices steady and reassuring. It was a small sacrifice, they said, a simple thing to help win the war. Your mother might have stood in the kitchen, listening to the static hum of the radio, holding an empty tin in her hand, wondering how something so small could suddenly feel so important. At first, there was confusion. Mrs. Helen Carter, a fictional name, but a real kind of woman, stood at the drugstore counter in Springfield, Illinois, on a Tuesday afternoon in late April. She was 34 years old with 2 children and a husband working at the munitions plant on the edge of town. She held her empty Colgate tin in one hand, her purse in the other. The pharmacist, Mr. Walsh, looked at it, nodded, and handed her a new one. "That's it?" she asked. "That's it," he said. "But don't lose this one. Next time, no tin, no powder." She slipped the new tin into her purse, feeling the cool metal against her palm. It felt heavier than it used to. Or maybe she was just paying attention now. Frank Carter, her husband, came home that evening smelling of oil and metal shavings. He washed his hands at the kitchen sink, dried them on the towel hanging by the stove, and asked what was for dinner. "Meatloaf," Helen said. "With carrots." "Again?" "Meat's been tight this week." He nodded. Everyone knew about the meat rationing. Everyone knew about the sugar stamps and the gasoline coupons. But nobody had thought much about tooth powder. Not yet. 8-year-old Margaret Carter stood in the doorway, watching her mother set the table. She didn't understand rationing yet. Not really. She knew they had to save tinfoil and bring it to school for the scrap drives. She knew her father worked longer hours now. She knew her mother counted ration stamps at the kitchen table every Sunday evening, her lips moving silently as she calculated meals for the week. But she didn't know that even cleanliness could be rationed. Not yet. But the strictest rules hadn't even begun. By the fall of 1942, the tin had woven itself into the rhythm of daily life. Every morning, before breakfast, before the children dressed for school, before your father left for the factory, there was the bathroom ritual. The twist of the lid, the dip of the brush, the rasp of bristles against powder, the faint taste of mint and chalk, the careful scrubbing up and down, back and forth, the way the dentist had told you to do it. And then, carefully, you'd screw the lid back on, because you couldn't afford to spill it, couldn't afford to knock it off the shelf, couldn't afford to let your youngest child play with it, tipping it over, watching the white powder scatter across the floor like snow. That tin had to last. The Carter family, Helen, Frank, Margaret, and 6-year-old Tommy, kept their tin on the second shelf of the medicine cabinet, next to the aspirin and the iodine. Every Sunday evening, after dinner, after the dishes were washed and put away, Helen would take it down and check how much was left. "Half gone," she'd say quietly, sliding it back into place. Frank would glance at the calendar on the wall. 3 more weeks till the 1st of the month. "We'll make it," she'd say. But she wasn't sure. Because the rule was simple. 1 tin per family per month. Maybe 2 if you had a large household and could prove it to the ration board. But for most families, 1 tin had to stretch across 4, 5, sometimes 6 people. And if you ran out early, you waited. Or you found other ways. Individuals frequently made their own tooth powders at home using recipes of calcium carbonate, precipitated chalk, and Castile soap with herbal oils added for flavor. Some families mixed baking soda with a little salt, maybe a drop of peppermint oil if they had it. It worked, It wasn't perfect, but it worked. Helen Carter kept a small jar of baking soda in the cupboard just in case. She'd learned the recipe from her mother, who'd learned it from hers. You mixed 1 part salt to 3 parts baking soda, added a tiny bit of water to make a paste, and brushed gently. It tasted terrible, salty and bitter and gritty, but it cleaned your teeth. Better than nothing, her mother had said. And by late 1942, better than nothing became a common refrain in American households. Others simply brushed less. Once a day instead of twice. Once every other day if times were tight. Children especially felt the change. Margaret Carter had been taught to brush her teeth every morning and every night. But by late 1942, her mother started saying, "Just in the morning, sweetheart. Save it for when it counts." Margaret didn't ask why. She already knew. The tin on the shelf was getting lighter every week. She'd hold it sometimes when her mother wasn't looking, feeling the weight shift inside, shake it gently, listening to the soft whisper of powder settling against the metal, wondering how many more mornings it would last. Tommy, her younger brother, didn't think about it much. He was 6. He brushed when his mother told him to brush, ate when she told him to eat, and went to bed when she turned off the lights. But even he noticed in his own quiet way that his mother was more careful now, that she measured things, that nothing got wasted. During this time, about 5,600 local rationing boards across America managed civilian access to scarce goods. Volunteers, neighbors, school teachers, shopkeepers staffed these boards, reviewing applications, distributing ration books, answering questions. They were the ones who decided if your family qualified for an extra tin. They were the ones who held the rules, and the rules were strict. Mrs. Eleanor Hoffman, a school teacher in her 50s, sat on the Springfield Ration Board. She'd lived in the same house for 30 years, taught 3 generations of children, and knew nearly every family in town. She took her volunteer work seriously. Too seriously, some said. When Helen Carter came to the board office in November 1942 asking for an extra tin because her family had run out, Mrs. Hoffman looked at her over the rims of her glasses. "How many people in your household?" "4. "And when did you receive your last tin?" 3 weeks ago." Mrs. Hoffman made a note. 3 weeks isn't a month, Mrs. Carter." "I know, but the ration is 1 tin per family per month. If you've run out early, I suggest you make your own. Baking soda and salt work just fine." Helen felt her face flush. "Yes, ma'am." She walked home that afternoon feeling smaller than she had in years, feeling judged, feeling like she'd failed some invisible test of patriotism. But something else was happening too, something quieter. Tooth powder tins became markers of respectability, of discipline, of doing your part. If your neighbor saw you with a brand new tin every other week, they might wonder, they might ask, they might report you for hoarding. Because in 1942, waste was unpatriotic, and hoarding was worse. People watched each other, not cruelly necessarily, but carefully, paying attention, making sure everyone was following the rules, making sure no one was getting more than their share. Your grandmother might remember this. The way her neighbors looked at each other in the grocery store line, the way conversations paused when someone pulled out a ration book, the quiet judgment that came with abundance and the quiet shame that came with need. Yet the hardest moments were still ahead. Not every family could follow the rules the same way. In the cities, drugstores carried tooth powder regularly. You'd bring in your empty tin, hand it over, get a new one. Simple. But in rural areas, farms scattered across Iowa, Montana, the Dakotas, the nearest drugstore might be 20 miles away. Families would make the trip once a month, sometimes less. And if the store ran out of tooth powder, if the shipment didn't come, you went home empty-handed, and you made do. Salt worked as a substitute. So did baking soda, straight from the box. Some families even used crushed charcoal, though it was rough on the gums and left your mouth tasting bitter for hours. But the disparity was real. Urban families had access. Rural families had resilience. And then there was the black market. By 1943, shortages had created an underground economy. Meat, gasoline, sugar, tires, all of it traded in back rooms and alleyways, sold at inflated prices to those desperate enough to pay. Tooth powder wasn't as lucrative as meat or gasoline, but it was there. A tin that should have cost 20 cents might go for 50, maybe more, if the seller knew you were desperate. Some people paid it, quietly, shamefully. Helen Carter heard about it from her neighbor, Mrs. Kowalski, who whispered the information over the fence one afternoon while hanging laundry. "There's a man," she said, lowering her voice, "comes around on Thursdays, sells things. You know, off the books." Helen felt her stomach tighten. "What kind of things?" "Whatever you need. Sugar, butter, tooth powder." "How much?" "More than it's worth." Helen didn't ask any more questions. She went inside, opened the cupboard, and looked at her jar of baking soda. Still half full. They'd be fine. But she thought about it. More than she wanted to admit. Others refused. In Chicago, a neighborhood grocer named Mr. Kowalski, no relation to Helen's neighbor, was caught selling tooth powder tins without collecting the empties. The local ration board shut him down for 2 weeks. The newspaper ran a small notice, "Grocer fined for ration violations." Nobody forgot, because in a time when everyone was sacrificing, breaking the rules felt like betrayal, like stealing from the soldiers overseas, like failing the test. But not everyone had the same ability to pass that test. Families with money could stockpile before the rules tightened. Families with connections might get a little extra from a sympathetic pharmacist. Families with neither. They brushed with salt and hoped their teeth held out till the war ended. Your great-grandparents might have been one of those families, the ones who made it work, the ones who never complained, the ones who measured out baking soda and salt in the dim. Bathroom light, mixing it with a little water, brushing carefully, rinsing thoroughly, and saying nothing about it. Because complaining was unpatriotic. And they were patriots. Churches, especially in small towns, started running what they called ration relief programs. On Sunday afternoons after services, the ladies' auxiliary would gather in the church basement and mix batches of homemade tooth powder, baking soda, salt, a little dried peppermint leaf crushed fine. They'd portion it into small paper envelopes, fold them carefully, and distribute them to families in need. Nobody called it charity. They called it helping out. And still the tin circulated. Empties turned in at the counter. New ones handed over the counter. The metal collected, melted down, reshaped into something for the war effort. A bomb casing, a shell, a piece of a ship. Your grandmother's tooth powder tin might have ended up somewhere in the Pacific. Might have been part of the metal that brought a soldier home. Might have been one small piece of the victory that everyone was working toward. But then, something shifted. By the winter of 1944, the war had dragged on longer than anyone expected. The news from Europe was hopeful. The Allies were advancing, but progress was slow, costly. And on the home front, shortages deepened. The Battle of the Bulge in December stretched resources even thinner. Factories that had started producing small amounts of civilian goods were shut down again. Toothpaste tubes, already scarce, nearly disappeared from shelves. Tooth powder tins became even harder to find. Helen Carter stood in line at the drugstore in January 1945, her empty tin in her coat pocket, her breath visible in the cold air. She'd been waiting for 40 minutes. The line stretched out the door. Ahead of her, Mrs. Patterson shifted her weight from foot to foot. "How long's this going to take?" "As long as it takes," someone muttered. When Helen finally reached the counter, Mr. Walsh looked tired, deep circles under his eyes. His white pharmacist's coat wrinkled. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Carter," he said. "We're out." "Out?" "Shipment didn't come. Try next week." She felt the weight of the empty tin in her pocket, felt the 3 weeks still left in the month, felt her children's faces in her mind. "Next week," she repeated. "I'm sorry." She walked home slowly, the cold wind cutting through her coat. Frank was already home when she arrived, sitting at the kitchen table with the newspaper spread in front of him. "Any luck?" he asked. She shook her head. He sighed, folded the paper. On page 6, buried among the war news and the casualty lists, was a small notice. Civilian goods production halted, pending war needs. That night, Helen mixed baking soda with a little water, forming a paste. She told the children to use it sparingly, told them to rinse well, told them it wouldn't be forever. Tommy, 6 years old, wrinkled his nose. "It tastes bad." "I know, sweetheart. When will we get more?" "Soon." But she didn't know. Margaret, now 11, brushed without complaining. She'd learned, over the past 3 years, that complaining didn't help, that everyone was struggling, that her mother was doing the best she could. Across America, families faced the same quiet crisis. Not dramatic, not deadly, just wearing. The small humiliation of running out. The small fear that maybe, this time, there wouldn't be more. Your grandfather might have been one of those men who came home from the factory, washed his hands, and brushed his teeth with salt. He might have stood at the bathroom sink, looking at himself in the mirror, wondering when things would get back to normal, wondering if normal would ever feel the same again. And buried inside the rules, there was something most people had overlooked. Oh boy. A tiny line of text at the bottom of the ration notices. A clause about substitutions. A quiet allowance for families to make their own tooth powder at home, using household ingredients if they could prove they'd tried to turn in an empty tin and found none available. Most people never knew about it because it was printed so small, mentioned so rarely, and by the time families needed it most, they'd already improvised their own solutions. Mrs. Hoffman at the ration board knew about it. She'd read every regulation, memorized every clause, but she rarely mentioned it, because if everyone knew, everyone would claim they couldn't find tooth powder. Everyone would stop bringing in their empties, and the metal would stop flowing to the war effort. So the rule stayed hidden. A secret printed in fine text at the bottom of a government form that nobody read. Helen Carter never knew about it, never knew that she could have walked into the ration board office, shown her empty tin and the note from Mr. Walsh saying the drugstore was out, and received a small paper envelope of government-issued tooth powder substitute, baking soda and calcium carbonate, mixed and measured by the ration board itself. She never knew because nobody told her, and so she kept mixing baking soda and salt in the dim bathroom light, kept brushing, kept rinsing, kept going. But the war effort needed that metal, needed it more than it needed clean teeth at home. And so the tins kept disappearing, until finally, one day in the spring of 1945, they started coming back. Victory in Europe came in May 1945. The radio crackled with the news. Frank Carter stood in the living room, hands in his pockets, listening. Helen stood beside him, one hand pressed to her mouth. "It's over," he said. "In Europe," she said. "It's a start." Victory in Japan followed in August. And slowly, quietly, the shelves began to fill again. By late 1945, the War Production Board lifted restrictions on consumer goods. Factories that had been making ammunition and tanks began retooling for toasters and radios, and yes, tooth powder tins. Helen Carter walked into the drugstore in September, no empty tin in her pocket this time, and saw a full display of Colgate tins stacked on the counter. Bright red labels, shiny metal, dozens of them. She stood there for a moment, just looking. "No trade-in?" she asked Mr. Walsh. He smiled. It was the first real smile she'd seen on his face in years. "Not anymore." She bought 2. One for now, one just in case. Because once you've gone without, you don't forget. Frank Carter, holding the new tin that evening, turned it over in his hands. It felt lighter than he remembered, or maybe he'd just gotten used to carrying heavier things. "Feels strange," he said. "What does?" "Not having to turn in the old one." Helen took the tin from him, twisted the lid, smelled the faint peppermint. "We earned it." And they had. Margaret, now 11, brushed her teeth that night with powder from the new tin. She stood at the bathroom sink, the white porcelain gleaming in the light, and she thought about the years when her mother had measured it out so carefully. Thought about the mornings when they'd brushed with baking soda and salt. Thought about the weight of that small tin on the medicine cabinet shelf. She didn't say anything, but she remembered. Tommy, 8 now, didn't remember a time before the tins were rationed. To him, this was just how things were, how they'd always been. But his parents remembered. They remembered standing in line, remembered the empty shelves, remembered the taste of salt and baking soda rough against their gums. They remembered the weight of a small metal tin and the quiet power it had held over their daily lives. The rule about turning in empties had been simple, but it had taught them something deeper, that even the smallest things could be rationed, that even cleanliness could become a privilege, that survival in wartime meant learning to live with less. And they'd done it. In Springfield, Mrs. Hoffman, the school teacher who sat on the ration board, filed away the last of the paperwork in October 1945. 3 years of regulations, 3 years of rules, 3 years of families asking for a little more, and her saying no. She closed the file cabinet drawer, locked it, and walked home. Nobody thanked her. Nobody blamed her. She'd just done her job, and now it was over. Post-war impact. The war ended, but there was terrible beasts. But the habit stayed. For years afterward, families who'd lived through the rationing kept their tooth powder tins long after they were empty. Kept them in drawers, in cupboards, in boxes in the attic, just in case. Helen Carter never threw away an empty tin for the rest of her life. She'd rinse them out, stack them neatly in the back of the linen closet. Frank would ask gently if she wanted to get rid of them. "Not yet," she'd say, because those tins were proof that they'd made it through, proof that they'd done their part. Your grandmother might have been the same way, might have kept jars and tins and boxes long past their usefulness, might have washed and reused aluminum foil, folded paper bags, saved string and rubber bands. Not because she was poor, but because she remembered. Across America, the culture of frugality that the war had demanded became a way of life. Women who'd learned to stretch a tin of tooth powder across a month didn't suddenly start wasting things when the war ended. Men who'd turned in their empties at the drugstore didn't forget the discipline it required. Children who'd grown up brushing with salt carried that memory into adulthood. They taught their own children to use things carefully, to make them last. Margaret Carter grew up, married, had children of her own. And when her daughter asked one evening in 1962 why Grandma kept so many empty jars, Margaret paused. "Because once," she said slowly, "we didn't have enough." "Enough of what?" "Enough of anything." And she told her daughter about the tin, about the rule, about the months when they brushed with baking soda and salt, and the weight of that small container, and the lesson it taught. Her daughter listened, nodded, and never forgot. Toothpaste had overtaken tooth powder as the more popular form of yitowo. Dentifrice by 1949, claiming around 75% of the market. But in homes where older folks still lived, where your great-grandparents held on to the old ways, tooth powder remained. Colgate still sold it. Dr. Lyons still manufactured it. The tins got smaller, the labels changed, but the product endured. And the tins themselves, those small, round metal containers, became relics. You can still find them today in antique shops and estate sales. Colgate, Squibb, Dr. Lyons, Calox, Pepsodent. The labels faded, the metal dented, the lids rusted shut. But if you hold one in your hand, you can feel the weight of what it once carried. Not just powder, not just cleanliness, but a lesson that in the hardest times, even the smallest things matter. That what we take for granted in peace becomes precious in war. That the rules we follow, no matter how small, shape who we become. And that sometimes the things that control us the most are the things we can hold in the palm of our hand. In the 1950s and 60s, as America prospered and abundance replaced scarcity, tooth powder slowly faded from most homes. Fluoride toothpastes became the standard when Crest was launched in 1955. Bright plastic tubes replaced metal tins. Advertising promised whiter teeth, fresher breath, better smiles. But in quiet homes where older folks still lived, you might still hear that sound. The soft scrape of metal on metal, the twist of a lid, the faint puff of powder rising in the bathroom light. And if you asked your grandmother about it, she might tell you about the war, about the rationing, about the months when a small tin governed her family's cleanliness. She might show you the empty tins she kept in the back of the closet, might turn one over in her hands, feeling the dents and scratches, the faded label, the rusted lid. "We made it through," she might say. And you'd nod, not quite understanding. Not yet. So tonight, if you open your medicine cabinet and see a tube of toothpaste sitting there, easy and abundant, take a moment. Think about the generation that came before, the ones who stood in line with an empty tin, hoping the shelves wouldn't be bare, the ones who brushed with salt when the powder ran out, the ones who taught their children to twist the lid carefully, to use just a little, to make it last. They didn't think of themselves as heroes. They were just doing what needed to be done. But in the process, they learned something we've mostly forgotten. That discipline isn't just about big sacrifices. It's about the small ones too, the ones no one sees, the ones that add up day after day, tin after tin, until the war is over and you realize you made it through. That little tin, no bigger than your palm, no heavier than a few ounces, controlled cleanliness during World War II. But more than that, it controlled something deeper. It controlled how families learned to survive, how they learned to measure, how they learned to make do, how they learned that dignity isn't about abundance, it's about discipline. Your grandmother knew this. Your grandfather knew this. They carried that knowledge with them long after the tins were gone. Long after the war was over. Long after the hardship faded into memory. And maybe, if you're quiet enough, if you listen carefully, you can still hear that sound. The soft scrape of metal on metal, the twist of a lid, the whisper of powder settling against the sides of a tin. The sound of survival, the sound of discipline, the sound of a generation that learned to live with less and became stronger for it. That little tin didn't just control cleanliness, it taught America how to endure. And in that small, quiet way, it helped win the war.